Hi everyone and welcome. I'm joined today by Dr. Michael Rossi, who's used to teach or still teach at the Rogers University in the United States. However, for the past 3 years, he's been teaching in Tashkent in Uzbekistan. Welcome to the program.
Glenn, it's a pleasure to meet you for the first time. And I just want to say off the bat here that how much I enjoy your work. I've read your book, Russophobia, and I'm really, really happy that we finally were able to connect.
Well, it's related to to what I want to speak about today with you because a key aspect of this, well, the liberal hegemony after the Cold War or the liberal international order, well, however one wants to frame it. A key component of this was always the idea that the West would have a collective hegemon. We would effectively rule the world. So we didn't need a multipolar system. We had a unipolar. However, it wouldn't be dictatorial because it would be a force for good because the West, as the champions of liberal democracy, would bring this to the rest of the world. So again, it's a common theme that is, you have to protect the good values from, rule of the majority. So in other words, this would be for the benefit of all. For some, of course, in the 90s and 2000s, a huge criticism in the literature was that, this was sounded like a new civilizing mission. That is, there would be one central power which would dominate, but again, it would be a force for good. We would use our power to civilize the world. But I guess a key weakness, which you have written an article about, is this moral righteousness. That is, if you assume that you are inherently good, that you're forced for good, and that conflicts they derive from the internal characteristics of states. So, we have good governance, so we have peace. This is the foundation of democratic peace theory. We have to make other countries a bit more like us to create the world in our own image. And this, of course, impacts how we deal with conflicts because if you think that you're morally righteous, how do you interpret conflicts? How do you make compromises? What's the role of diplomacy? So how do you see the moral righteousness of the West impacting relations with well, again, now Russia, as seems to be the boogeyman of the day?
Sure. So, as somebody who has worked in international relations for more than 20 years, I know I've come to the conclusion that I am a diehard constructivist. So I, absolutely have read the works of Alexander Wendt, Ted Hopf, and understand that foreign policy is largely designed around how states perceive themselves in the world and how they perceive others. And this is something which helps explain the moral limits, the moral poverty of liberalism, which has been critiqued by many realists, John Mearsheimer, most notably, in this day and age. But I think that one of the biggest assumptions that liberalism operates on is what you had just said, is that liberalist states operate within an understanding of moral righteousness. And how do they justify that? They simply say that they are doing the greater good. Right? They can't point to empirical evidence. They don't have statistics. At best, they can point to past patterns of foreign policy. The United States will frequently point to its involvement in the First and Second World Wars. The United States operates on a narrative, and it's a rather potent narrative that we're the good guys. And we may not start wars, but we end wars. We end wars started by morally unrighteous countries, whether they happen to be from the extreme right or the extreme left. And it's an echo chamber that is frequently repeated through American media, through education, through pop culture. And it's not necessarily specific to the United States. It operates within the UK. It operates within the European Union. And I think that it is most prominently displayed right now in what is really the remnants of the EU attempting to keep the good fight in Ukraine going after Donald Trump has basically thrown Ukraine under the bus, which many of us who study this, many of us in the realist camp and the constructivist camp, knew that it was really a matter of time before Ukraine had served its purpose for American interests, and it eventually would either be defunded or just simply abandoned. The European Union feels that it must keep this mantle of struggle against a perceived enemy going. And look, let's be perfectly honest here. The perception of Russia as the aggressor country is pretty obvious, considering that it was Russia that invaded another country. So right there, the narrative is written effectively for everybody else. But when it becomes apparently obvious that the war is not winnable from the Ukrainian side, or that Western support for this country has done little more than keep it alive for 2 to 3 weeks at a clip, and that Ukraine is unfortunately undergoing internal political change that becomes more and more reminiscent of an ethnocentric state than an all multi-ethnic inclusive one, kind of lays hollow the narrative of this liberalist moral righteousness, especially when these very same countries are turning a blind eye and a deaf ear to other crimes against humanity that's happening around the world, most notably within the Gaza Strip, in which, and I'm just going to come flat out and say, I mean, we are basically talking about the most brazen case of state-sponsored genocide since the Second World War. And these very liberalist countries that claim to defend Ukraine at all costs are doing everything possible to prevent any open criticism, any open protest against the state of Israel. So, my point here is to simply note that all it takes is just an empirical observation of states that operate on the liberalist perspective, and you begin to realize that the narrative sounds nice, but it ultimately does little more than advance national interests of states who believe that what they do is somehow morally better, more superior than what China or Russia or Iran or India or Serbia does.
Yeah, I find myself more in the neoclassical realist camp, but in which the international distribution of power, the foreign policy making or decision making, that you have the decision makers as an intervening variable between the distribution of power and foreign policy. And it is problematic because, well, what I find brings some value from the constructivists is that most other theories, they're premised on the states being rational actors. But it's very hard to argue that a lot of the Western political actors at this point in time are acting rational, as you said,
Right.
when the war is being lost and tomorrow will be worse than it is today, you can't win. Uh, the rational actor would strike a deal today if it's better than tomorrow, and yet it
Yeah.
becomes impossible.
Yes.
And how do you see though the West having, I guess, otherized, we say, or Russia, that is to make it its mirror image, the evilness to our goodness. How does this work?
Yeah, I think that Western liberalism, beginning really in, let's say, the early to mid 19th century, and certainly culminating in the aftermath of the Second World War, the Cold War, the post-Cold War period, looks at the world in a very binary way, us versus them. The liberalist side sees us as the coalition of, we've already said, morally righteous, intellectually superior, rational actors against the collective other, the West versus the rest. There's a very clear strand of Orientalism that goes into this. And whether it's Russia or Iraq or Serbia or China, Venezuela, the understanding is that these countries, whoever they happen to be, and it's not necessarily specific to a geographic area. Serbia is within Europe. Venezuela, Cuba is within Latin America. But these countries operate on a foreign policy and an ideology that is not only an alternative to Western liberalism, but is perceived to act as a direct counter to Western liberalism, which sees it as a threat. And the Orientalist mantle, and here I'm drawing specifically from Said, is that the other, the non-West, can either be pigeonholed into two stereotypical assumptions. The first is weak, backward, undeveloped, primordial, that needs the West for modernization, for industrialization, and for democratization. So these countries, Russia included, can join the coalition of Western liberal states, but not as equals, but as applicants, supplicants, mind you. And they will always be seen in a lesser state. The other is that if they reject this and they opt for their own alternative foreign policy, which I think was most visibly seen beginning with, let's say, Vladimir Putin's 2007 speech at the Munich Security Conference, and then, of course, continues to expand within the next decade and a half, including the annexation of Crimea, the position on Ukraine that regards Russia as an equal partner for peace, along with the United States and NATO, China's One Belt, One Road policy. Effectively, any country that sees an alternative to that of Western liberalism is now seen as a threat, an existential threat. So the other can either be weak, dependent, and utterly reliant on the West, or it can be seen as a basic threat to civilization, Western civilization, for that matter. And what I want to finish out with this is the assumption from the liberalist mindset is that by placing one's foreign policy into a commitment to a region or to a state, whether it's Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova, or supporting the disputed territorial sovereignty of Kosovo, the state of Israel against Palestine, liberalism locks a country into this commitment, making it incredibly costly to deviate from that commitment, because it makes it look like the state in question is now going back on its word, and everything that it wanted you to know that it was absolutely convinced, its convictions in this state, are now effectively lies. And the country in question would rather continue a policy, a drastic, destructive policy, than admit that they were wrong. And while I'm no fan of Trump's foreign policy, I'm no fan of Trump as a president, I think one of the greatest sins that he has committed in the eyes of Western liberalists, not just political elites, but also the media, the media industrial complex that creates these narratives, is that he betrayed Ukraine, and he betrayed the West, and he betrayed America's commitment to aiding countries around the world that seek our help.
Yeah, this is makes course correction very difficult because
Absolutely.
if you pursue the policy, you realized, well, yeah, we can't win this war, or yeah, for some reason we have to choose something different. It's that's painful enough. But if you already created a consensus around this policy based on it being, as you said, morally righteous, that it's good. In other words, the alternatives are just bad and evil and a betrayal of this sacred values which we should hold the dearest,
Yes.
it's very difficult to actually turn around and say, well, we made a mistake. Um, and yeah, this is the yeah one of the key concern. But you said something interesting as well about related to NATO, because in the 1990s when NATO began to expand, it was under the name of being a force for good. So there was a very interesting reassurance deterrence balance, because on one hand, the Russians had to be reassured, well, you don't have to worry about NATO expanding. We're not the Cold War military bloc anymore. Now we're containing you. Now we're a liberal democratic community. So
Yes.
you should be happy that we're rolling up on your borders, because we'll bring a region of peace and stability. So, you should be, don't worry about it. However, if you do reject this, that means you reject democracy
Yes.
and civilization itself, which means then you're a threat, and we're gonna have to go back to our original goal, our mission of containing you. So you have these conflicting messages that we will deter you, but also reassure you. And well, effectively, the message to the Russians was, whatever you do, accept this or resist it. Either way, we will continue to move towards your borders.
Yes.
And yeah, I guess the role they were given was, can either accept this role as a civilizational student, and look to us for leadership. We won't give a seat at the table, but you can accept our leadership, learn from us to become
Yes.
like us, or you can be our adversary, but then we have to contain you, possibly defeat you. This is the only option they effectively got. And this is, yeah, this is a problem though, isn't it? How can you have sovereign equals if your morality and your goodness and your liberal
Yeah.
democratic values suggest that you have more right to sovereignty, that you're more, again, you don't want to be a moral relativist. So I can even see that argument. Why should North Korea be represented in the same way as South Korea? They don't represent their own people. So I can see where the argument comes from. But you do create a very structure of hierarchy, though, in the world.
Hmm.
But how would this how do you see any of this triggering or leading to the war?
Well, as you pointed out, NATO has this very paradoxical rationale by increasingly expanding. They like to use the word enlarging. Others say expanding. Okay, fine. The biggest problem with NATO's narrative is that they fail to take anyone else's perception into account. And to perceive NATO as anything other than this expanding force for good is already the problem of the perceiver, right? So NATO is going to expand. NATO is going to take the Baltics. They're going to take pretty much every country in Warsaw Pact. They're going to move right up to Russia's borders. And at the Bucharest summit in 2008, they also said that Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine also have a possible future in NATO, should these countries want. And NATO will continue to expand until Russia asks. This was one of the big things that NATO seems to look the other way. And if we have to take Vladimir Putin at face value, we can say that, he had basically said at one point, he asked, can Russia join NATO? This was him asking this in 2000. Bill Clinton was still president. And the answer that Clinton gave him was, no, that's just not going to happen. Okay. Can we at least engage in some kind of bilateral peace agreement and see each other as equals? NATO's response was no. But yet at the same time, we're not a threat. So I can effectively do the same. I can move up to your property line with a loaded gun, and I can point that gun at your house. And you can turn around and say, what are you doing? And I say, this is for self-defense. Don't worry. I'm not going to be aggressive. But if you perceive me standing, not even on your property line, but in your driveway with a loaded gun, if you perceive me as a threat, well, that's your problem. And you perceiving me as a threat, I'm going to perceive you as a threat. NATO is basically creating its own security dilemma and then getting aghast when countries like Russia or Serbia or Iran see NATO as anything other than a threat. While at the same time, if Russia were to do the same thing, if there was to be a military alliance between, let's say, the BRICS countries or something like that, NATO would absolutely see this as a threat. I mean, we have been talking about these scenarios now for years, if not decades. Mearsheimer, once again, was talking in the 90s about disbanding NATO because NATO had done its job. NATO succeeded in its primary objective, which was to be a collective security force against the Soviet alliance of Warsaw Pact. But the big problem with NATO disbanding at the time is that victors in the Cold War don't give up their leverage. The United States saw itself as the winner of the Cold War. And what should NATO do? Should NATO disband? Should there be a new European collective military force? No. Why would the United States do this? The United States now has leverage. And the other thing is that Europe keeps looking to the United States for leadership. So it's not like the US is convincing Europe that they need them. Europe keeps telling the United States, we need you. The security dilemma in the Balkans that spiraled out from the collapse of Yugoslavia, the United States had said, first under Bush the Elder and then Clinton, this Europe is your issue. This is your so-called hour of Europe. It is your responsibility to mitigate this conflict and find an end to it. And it didn't happen. And the US steps in, first with Bosnia, and then 4 to 5 years later with Kosovo. So NATO seems to continue to legitimize itself under the auspices of US leadership because the European countries that are part of NATO are more than happy to remain free riders. And it is only recently, since Trump's second inauguration, where Europe is now experiencing a wake-up call that perhaps the United States, A, is not the leader that we thought it would be, and B, this is even more rich, that the United States may be more of a liability than an asset for our transatlantic partnership. But then what do we do with NATO? Do we disband NATO? I don't think so. Although many who are fans of NATO and many who are part of NATO's upper hierarchy have effectively said that NATO must be in this, remain in this conflict with Russia over Ukraine for the sake of NATO's future, for its legitimacy. If Ukraine loses this war, NATO loses the war, and its reason for existence now comes into significant question. And this is ultimately the issue, once again, with liberalism. It has less to do with the country that the proxy war is being waged in, but one's reputation and one's commitment to something that they have put their name and reputation on.
Yeah, in terms of the Europeans gaining some autonomy from the United States, I think the wars in the Western Balkans are a good example. But if you forward to the present day, it's quite remarkable that you have someone, yeah, like J.D. Vance, who actually has to tell the Europeans, we don't need vassals. We need, independent partners. So essentially, the United States asking the Europeans to stop being vassals to the United States. This is, yeah, it's quite remarkable that these speeches could be had. I mean, I know if some people would have called the Europeans vassals, some would have, maybe come with the, yeah, so this is propaganda or something. But now the actual Americans are telling us it directly that, you're vassals, you should stand on your own feet. But on your comment though about NATO, do you think it would that it's coming to an end in its current form at least? Because especially from the German media lately, there's been some reports that if we lose the war in Ukraine, apparently now we. Until recently, we weren't participants, but there's a lot of mixed messages here. But yeah, if we lose the war in Ukraine, then NATO's done for. It's dead.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you make sense of this? Is this because of the the ability, the hegemonic idea that NATO always has the final say, or is it because
Yeah,
the people within the bloc will then start to ask questions about, why did we go down
yeah,
this route, or
sure.
why do you think NATO is in such well, that people are not planning its funeral, but perhaps fearing it?
Yeah, I think that this is a lot of sensationalism. States that are ideologically committed to something and then walk away from it years later survive. The United States walked away from Iraq. We walked away from Afghanistan. We walked away from Vietnam. We're still here. There's this fear that if we go back on our word, that no one will ever trust us again. I mean, let's just say that that's the case, that there is growing skepticism in the United States against our foreign policy adventures. There is growing skepticism, growing hostility against, the perceptions of things like the state of Israel, or whether or not it's worth supporting Ukraine's effort. Many people are asking why, and it's not callous, and it's not. I wouldn't say it's not selfish, but it's a question that deserves asking, and it deserves an answer. And if Americans are asking this, Europeans are asking the same thing. Why? Why is Ukraine the line that we cannot cross? Why is it that Ukraine is the threshold between civilization and barbarity? NATO has expanded again since the outbreak of the war, with the inclusion of Sweden and Finland, two erstwhile neutral states. And if I were Zelensky at this moment, I would, and I'm sure that he has asked this. It's like, why are you giving membership to Sweden and Finland when we're the ones that need it the most? And NATO's response to Zelensky is, you can get into NATO when you have defeated Russia on the battlefield. Which, as soon as I heard that, if I were Zelensky, I would have immediately called for a ceasefire, because I knew that I was being gaslit. If Ukraine can defeat Russia on the battlefield, which it can't, but let's just say that it does, why would it need NATO? NATO's, I think, ultimate goal is to use Ukraine as a way of unifying the European continent. With the addition of Finland, and if you visualize the map of Europe, you have Finland, the Baltics, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, almost a north-south axis, all the way down to the Black Sea. That effectively creates a new diplomatic and ideological iron curtain between the West and the rest. Ukraine, whether it gets partitioned, whether it just remains an unspoken frozen conflict, like Georgia, like the Kosovo issue, is inconsequential. What matters is that these are lightning rods. These become symbols for the narrative of NATO's necessary continuation to happen. So, no, I don't see that NATO will disband. I see that NATO will become probably even more resolute, because liberalists don't abandon an ideological commitment that easy, unless the area is no longer a trending hashtag and has become such a back page newsmaker that you can abandon it without much fuss. Afghanistan was abandoned 20 years after we had gone in. And yes, forget the fact that the Taliban took the country in as many days as the United States had occupied the country in years. The minute that the last plane flew out of Kabul in a perfect Saigon manner, the White House's response was that we had achieved our goal anyway 20 years earlier by knocking out al-Qaeda and eliminating Osama bin Laden. The rest of the stuff was just, retroactively regarded as cosmetic. One could easily say the same thing about Ukraine. Let's say that in addition to Sweden and Finland joining, Ireland joins, Austria joins. Not like this is going to change the game anymore, but what does it do? It unifies the European continent across the board, with the European Union and NATO now forming almost a complete circle in a Venn diagram. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say at this point, NATO has become even more powerful and more prominent than the European Union. The European Union is effectively NATO's financial arm, and NATO, even now under Trump, has become little more than the military appendage of the United States. And if Trump's tenure is finished after 4 years, his successor is not elected, and we go back to some kind of Reagan Democrat or something like that, right? I guarantee you that the resumption of the transatlantic alliance, the recommitment to NATO's existence on this planet is going to be even 10 times more resolute. Trump was just a little more than a hiccup, a temporary speed bump in what is ultimately the larger prize. And I think this is what liberalists are certainly looking at.
Well, I guess this also key concern of Trump because as he shifts focus, people from his administration, such as Marco Rubio, they explain it as the disengagement with Europe. That this is simply the new international distribution of power. That is, you know how many centers of power the United States needs to make priorities. So again, if you're going to pivot to somewhere, the Western Hemisphere or Asia, you have to pivot away from somewhere, and that would be Europe, which is less priority. But
Sure.
what is fascinating is when we don't discuss these things in Europe, the power dimension of it. We interpret it through this ideology that is, what does this mean? Because we were a club of democracies. He's
Yes.
betraying democracy. Is this the downfall of democracy? So we see this club of NATO and the political West as the solidarity is required to uphold democracy itself. So anyone who effectively then challenges the cohesion of NATO
Yeah.
challenges democracy
Yes.
itself. And this is kind of why, so when he's what wants to end the war, they don't, in Europe, they don't see, well, the war has been lost, America has different priorities, and we do a rational assessment. We see, oh, wait, why is he leaning towards Putin, which is a dictator, and away from us, and we're the liberal democracies? And we see it only in this ideological framework, though, that,
Yeah.
and it doesn't leave too many rational, sensible conclusions because
Hmm.
now it's effectively Trump is doing something almost evil. He's betraying democracy and serving the dictatorships. So
Hmm.
how can we stop him? This is
Hmm.
the, this is the extent of our analysis.
Sure.
Not that different from the Russians, but in terms of solving the conflict, solving the conflict, to what extent do you see this heavy ideology being problematic because we are in the middle of an efforts to mediate as we
Yeah.
see what I found I guess remarkable about Kellogg's recent push is as well as many of his colleagues is he doesn't appear to recognize NATO and the US as participants. Indeed, the US
Yeah.
has transformed itself to a mediator now, even
Yeah.
though it's been one of the key actors. And when Kellogg says, the Ukrainians have to do this, the Russians have to do this, the demands on NATO haven't been put forward as if NATO's not part of this conflict at all. Do you
Yeah.
see this as well, some form of an extension of this, force for good, moral righteousness?
I mean, this is ultimately an extension of Trump's America First policy. Trump does not like allies and partners. He doesn't like bringing others along for the collective dialogue. He likes one-on-one dialogue. This is sort of the simplicity of Trump's unilateral outlook on the world. He sees himself as somebody who, like a businessman, can sit down with Putin or Xi Jinping or Erdogan or Modi or whoever it happens to be. And within a couple of hours, we can hash out a deal. Europe, as far as he's concerned, is inconsequential. I mean, he's made it abundantly clear Europe is inconsequential. And NATO is, it's hard to say what Trump's opinion of NATO is, but it is very easy for us to understand that as far as Trump is concerned, Ukraine is Biden's war. Ukraine is the Democratic Party's war. And so, with that, he has little investment in this conflict. He would absolutely love to end it so he can take the credit for being the peacemaker, not the Democratic Party, not the Biden, Obama, neoliberal camp that wants to continue the war with the hope that one more group of sanctions, one more counter offensive will roll the Russian defensive lines back. And if we all just get together and work hard, Zelensky can deliver his victory speech in Crimea within a year. I mean, this is a fool's dream at this point, unfortunately. And this is not to take any side, whether you're on the pro-Russian side or the pro-Ukrainian side. I mean, it's done. The Ukrainian side has been completely demoralized. The Russian side has proven to be quite resilient. So when not so much NATO, but Europe, the EU, Macron and Starmer and now Merz, Meloni, they all are saying we deserve a voice at the table too. Trump's response is, no, you don't. What have you done? And this plays actually quite well into Russia's hands, because Lavrov was asked this question about a month or two ago. I have this video up on my YouTube channel in which he was asked at a press conference, are you upset that Europe is not being involved in the peace negotiations? And his response was, Europe abrogated that right to be a mediator long ago when they decided that it was in their best interest to continue this war for what he sees as ultimately the main objective, and that is destabilizing Russia, weakening Russia, and having Russia crumble. So Europe's position, while loosely unified on some kind of principle that we need to be involved in the negotiating process, doesn't hold a lot of water in terms of what terms that they're proposing. Because right now, Russia holds the advantage in Ukraine. The one thing that Europe still has as its ace in the hole is that Russia's primary demand in a ceasefire is for a readjustment of Ukraine's borders, right? The full inclusion of 4 regions plus Crimea, which completely challenges, negates the post-war international order in which borders are sacrosanct. We do not change the borders. Except, of course, if Kosovo
was
involved, Kosovo was involved, right? And this is the one thing that I will always bring up, because that issue was already violated, and Russia is constantly using that as a footnote, to which the very powers that insist on Ukraine's territorial integrity are the ones insisting that Serbia must recognize Kosovo as an independent country if it wants to get into the European Union. And when Kosovo is brought up, the best excuse that we can get is, that's a different story. That doesn't count. That's a special case. Once again, why is it a special case? Because I said so. There's no other reason for it. There was no justification for it, but okay, it's a fait accompli. Others can say Kosovo has now been technically independent of Serbia for 25 years. So the writing is on the wall. Fair enough. Crimea has been independent of Ukraine for 10 years. The Donbas region for 3. So are you going to reintegrate a region that does not want to go back to the country that it broke away from? The Albanians don't want to go back to Serbia. The Ukraine, what do you want? The Russian-speaking Ukrainians, the ethnic Russian, the people in the Donbas region, by and large, do not want to get reintegrated into Ukraine. But we don't want to talk about that, because if we bring that up, it now brings the entire issue of state boundaries into question. So I understand Europe's hesitancy to engage in what Trump wants, which is right now, give Putin whatever it is that he wants. Give him Crimea, give him the eastern stuff, let Trump rump Ukraine and just kind of mine it. Just put the rest of the country up on eBay for exploitation. This is effectively the death of a country. This is the end of the sovereignty of a country. And Europe is simply not going to allow that to happen, not on their watch. And they certainly don't want it to happen while they realize that their hands were tied and they couldn't do anything. So they want to be involved, but what leverage they have right now is, at least by my vantage point, little more than rhetorical. There is very little actual leverage that Europe, and when I say Europe, I'm not even talking about the EU or NATO. We like to think that Europe is a collective monolith. It's not. And more to the point where you raised before about how these countries see themselves as the defenders of democracy. Well, to an extent, they're the defenders of liberal democracy when it benefits their purpose, And in other situations where it seems like the electoral front runner, like the presidential race in Romania, seems to once again be seeming to elect another Orban Fico-esque person, they will absolutely be more happy to support the Constitutional Court of Romania nullifying the elections. Yet they will absolutely do everything possible to support Maya Sandu's re-election in Moldova, despite the fact that only 2 polling stations in Russia for the diaspora were open, while multiple were open throughout Europe. So tell me again how this is a full-on defense of liberal democracy. If you subscribe and read The Atlantic, if you subscribe to the New York Times and read the op-ed section, or you absolutely take the Washington Post at face value, you're going to believe this stuff. But it's a very exclusive club of individuals who benefit still from this system. The rest of us, either on the populist right or sort of the collective Marxist, like me, skeptical left, see the rhetoric coming out of Europe, NATO, North America, the remnants of American neoliberalism, the Democratic Party and such, as empty words that are very difficult to take seriously.
The comment by Sergei Lavrov, though, there was something similar was actually said by Macron himself, because back in 2022, he did try to see if he can get a dialogue going with Putin, and the other Europeans were trying to reel him in, that this, make him fall in line, because the Europeans who were supposed to boycott diplomacy, to isolate Russia, don't talk to Putin. This was the idea. And then at that point, Macron actually at one point cautioned the other Europeans that if you do not engage diplomatically with the Russians, at some point there will be non-European powers negotiating a European peace. So he actually
Yes.
saw some of this coming. Well, it was kind of common sense. If you don't
Yes.
do diplomacy, then someone else will do it for you.
Yes.
Um, but in regards to the views or what's being done to Romania, Moldova, I can put Georgia in that category
Yes. Yes.
too.
Of course.
Is I think the idea is that we are a democracy. So if Russia is authoritarian, we are democratic. If a country is leaning towards us, then it's a triumph of democracy. If it's leaning towards Russia, then it's authoritarian. The problem there is, what if the majority of the public there voting for this, not even voting to join it? Like in Georgia, they merely didn't want to be a front line. Or in Moldova, there's of course more sympathies from large part of the population, but in Romania, they simply voted for a peace candidate. And then under this, you see that us being democratic, so we have to win. We can't do it with democratic means anymore. It is an interesting
Yeah.
problem.
Yes.
I wanted to, just my last question. What do you see as the main or the most harmful narratives in this war? I know there's quite a few, but
Sure.
which really traps us and makes it impossible, which locks us
Yeah.
into a destructive path, which we can't really back out of.
Right. So I mean, for the sake of clarity, for the sake of making certain that we're all on the same page, we use the word narrative a lot. And I loosely right now, I mean, I define narrative as, a collection of people, places, things that may not have any coherent connection to one another, but have been stitched together, imploded within a general framework of understanding to tell a story. A narrative ultimately tells a story. It's an interpretation, a very selective interpretation on what has happened. The Western narrative of the war in Ukraine is at the risk of oversimplifying it, solely and responsibly the actions of Vladimir Putin, who, out of desperation in trying to keep Ukraine from joining NATO and losing Russia's sphere of influence, decided to invade the country. Now, what the narrative avoids is the 8 years from the Euromaidan protests. Whether you want to call it a protest, a revolution, a coup, depends on what you're focusing on. The 8 years of conflict the constant warfare in the Donbass region, the radicalization of Ukrainian politics at the expense of all things Russian in the country, to the point where you're almost criminalizing the Russian language in media, in schools, and of course now the attempt at trying to shut down the largest branch of the Orthodox Church within the country. These things are left out. These narratives are left out because they're inconvenient to the West's narrative of us versus them. It doesn't give Russia justification for doing what it did, but it, at the absolute least, gives us an understanding of why Russia did what it did. It at least gives an understanding that NATO is a primary agent responsible for the security dilemma that resulted first in the 2014 color revolution, the annexation of Crimea, the 8-year frozen conflict in the Donbass region, the failure to implement the Minsk agreements, the Minsk Accords, which we now know Poroshenko and then Zelensky were told by the West not to implement, just stall, while we help you take the place back by military means, right? Disputed territories are problematic because they remain disputed. But if one can use the military to take them back, like Azerbaijan did with Karabakh, or Croatia in the 90s under Tudjman did with Krajina, then there's no more problem. This was seen by Russia, which in a last-ditch effort to find a solution, Putin reached out to NATO officials and to Biden in late 2020, if I'm not mistaken. No, 2021. I'm sorry, 2021, December 2021. All efforts at finding a solution were rebuffed. Now, again, does that justify invading another country and annexing territory? No. But does it put the story, does it put the picture of the scenario in a different light than the narrative that has been crafted? Absolutely. So the most dangerous part of these narratives is leaving out vital information that, if we put it in, questions our moral righteousness in this war. And I think that's the ultimate reason, is that liberalism, more than any of the other isms, tries to find a narrative to justify what liberalist states do to differentiate them from what non-liberalist states will do. Intervention by a liberalist state is necessary against the forces of evil. When China does it, when Russia does it, when Turkey does, you get the idea. That is raw power politics. That is empire. When we do it, we have a nobler purpose. The problem is that we never reach that purpose. The problem is that we never reach those goals.
Yeah, no, I think also narratives are, to a large extent, to serve the purpose of legitimizing something. But I noticed this as well. The narratives, because they trap us, they exclude by taking ourselves, our own culpability out of the context. There's no more solutions anymore. Again, if everything is unprovoked, then every solution becomes appeasement.
Yeah.
So, but I noticed if you challenge the narrative, then the question isn't whether or not your facts are correct. I've heard actually journalists, right? Well, why are you supporting the Russian narrative and not our narrative? So
Yeah.
they don't care about the facts behind it, because if you're what you're saying, the facts you're presenting is aligning closer with the Russian narrative, that means you're trying to lend legitimacy to them. So are you legitimizing the invasion, the theft of territory? And this is only thing they want to hear. But again, the narrative goes both ways. So yes, a narrative can be used to legitimize the Russian invasion, but the NATO narrative is also something that makes it impossible to actually do any course correction, to pursue any peace. So I think this is my main concern when I see all our political leaders just speaking in moral slogans and cliches and insisting on how moral they are. And again, whenever there's issues like, well, Ukraine must have the right for this, or this is the just thing, as if the premise here is that we're acting out solely out of altruism, that this is the goodness of humanity we've been following all along. So,
Sure. Of course, it
um,
also doesn't help. It also doesn't help that we somehow seem to be incredibly altruistic about the poor Ukrainians while doing absolutely nothing for the Palestinians. Nothing for the Palestinians.
well, in Germany, they do give very open support for Israel. However,
Yes,
if you criticize the genocide, then you might have problems with the police. It's quite an extraordinary turn of
exactly.
event. But yeah.
So look, people are not stupid anymore. And people are able to find not necessarily counter narratives, but evidence to debunk the prevailing narratives through social media, through Telegram or TikTok or Instagram or podcasts, other elements which people are turning more and more to. And no, just because I have a Telegram account does not mean that that I've signed up to the Russian narrative. But what it does do is lay bare the real transparency, the real problems that these liberalist narratives that are seen as unassailable in the West happen to be. And you're absolutely correct. Any kind of criticism is simply going to be leveled as, well, you support the other side. You don't have to support the other side. You simply have to say why. Why are we doing this? And yes, I understand that I'm asking, why are we defending a country that was invaded? How could the answer would be, why wouldn't you want to be? If your country was invaded, wouldn't you want? Yes, I get it. It's more of an emotional heartstring issue. But for multiple attempts at trying to prevent the outbreak of conflict or to get to the protracted social conflicts that were the underlying reasons for the outbreak of this war, is just seen as heretical, anathema in that regard. And if you claim to be the voice of moral righteousness, but then arrest people for condemning genocide because it's being committed by a state that you don't want to be angry about. If this was happening in any other country, I guarantee the EU would be absolutely up in arms over this. Absolutely up in arms over this, right? And yet it happens to another country. This is constructive. This is where constructivism comes in quite handily. We'll condemn a crime against humanity there because the country perpetrating it is a bad country. We'll overlook the crime against humanity there because that country is our ally. And there's no other way to describe it except selective diplomacy. And that is what liberalism, unfortunately, ends up being. And one does not have to be a Mearsheimer supporting realist in order for that to happen. Although I find myself agreeing with Mearsheimer about 80% of the time anyway.
Oh no, I love that guy. He's
Yeah,
got a
I
lot
mean,
of. He's a
listen,
great
he's
communicator as well. So no, it's
as
he,
I've
he called the
as I
Ukraine war though, and this is why when people now are saying, "Well, it's immoral that you arguing what you are," because it sounds like you're legitimizing the Russian position. But my view is that he very clearly and put himself, in the crossfire by arguing since 2014 that what we are doing here is destroying Ukraine. And
yes,
again, it's if you threatened to push NATO into Ukraine, Russia will destroy Ukraine.
yes, yes,
As simple as that. Doesn't mean you support it. It doesn't mean that you will applaud it or legitimize. That's just the reality of what's going to happen. And for that reason, I say we shouldn't do this.
yes,
And this has been a very clear position. But the fact that this is so difficult to accept, even though it's plainly obvious,
yeah.
it shows that yeah, we almost have to bring psychology, I guess, into political science to understand why this is an argument which you aren't allowed to make, but which is necessary to make if you want to restore peace on the continent.
Sure. But I've said before, remember about 15, 20 years ago, we were absolutely committed to Iraq. right? George W. Bush's whole thing is any criticism of our involvement in Iraq, he turns around and says, don't you want these people to have freedom? Don't you want these people to have democracy? I mean, we were so wedded to Iraq. Now we couldn't care less about Iraq at this point. At some point, we just got bored with it, which is what we're going to do with Ukraine. Trump's throwing Zelensky under the bus was sinful for two reasons. One, the country was thrown under the bus in real time, not behind the scenes. The first time we saw it live. And the second one is that we threw the country under the bus well before we were going to do so. We still have a need for it. Trump's whole way of wiping his hands clean of the Ukraine issue and cutting a deal with Russia is still seen by many as a betrayal, even though Zelensky has been told repeatedly that there has never been any promise of NATO membership. There would be no unanimity to allow Ukraine into NATO. And it's not just from the Hungarian or the Slovak perspective. It's from the German or the French perspective as well. They're not going to let Ukraine in. It's just not going to happen. And yet they still will, if at first you don't succeed, bash your head against the wall until either your skull or the wall cracks.
Yeah, so we're not going to let Ukraine in, even though we know this can end the war, and we don't want them inside anyway. So again, this is where the reasoning, the rationality, I guess, is in deficit. Anyways, yeah, Dr. Michael Rossi, thank you so much for your time. It's been very interesting.
Professor Diesen, a pleasure once again to have me on your show. I hope that we can continue this conversation in the near future. So it was great talking with you.
Thanks.